Have you ever wondered why human bodies can process alcohol at all? Or what drove our prehistoric ancestors to drink spoiled, bubbling seed water before agriculture even existed? To understand, step back 13,000 years into the shadowy depths of Reykjavik Cave. Inside, a Natufian gatherer named Ellen crouches over a deep bedrock mortar. Outside, cold autumn rain drenches limestone cliffs, while grief over a fallen hunter hangs heavy inside. Ellen leans over the stone cavity where trapped rainwater has soaked leftover wild barley. Sprouted seeds float beneath a layer of white foam. A sharp, sweet and sour scent hits his nostrils. Instinctively, Elan dips his cupped fingers into the frothing liquid and licks it. A sour kick turns sweet, followed by a warm flush spreading across his chest. Behind him, Kale, a younger hunter, snarls and grabs his spear, demanding they eat the grain dry before it spoils. But Ellen raises a hand, determined to soak their remaining winter seeds. What follows is a plausible reconstruction based on archaeological discoveries. Our ancestors did not invent alcohol, nature did. Yet deliberate brewing began roughly 13,000 years ago during the Stone Age. Long before humans plowed fields or built cities, mobile hunter-gatherers were already transforming wild grains into fermented drinks. To understand why Elan felt that sudden wave of chest heat, we have to travel even further back 10 million years, into the dense humid forests of the Miocene epoch. Long before early humans walked upright, our shared primate ancestors lived high in the canopy. Occasionally, overripe fruit dropped to the forest floor, bruising and rotting in the tropical heat. Microscopic wild yeasts quickly consumed the fruit sugars, producing ethanol as a natural byproduct. For most animals, ethanol was a toxic poison that caused disorientation and illness. But a critical genetic event altered the fate of our lineage. A single-point mutation occurred in the ADH4 gene, encoding an enzyme responsible for metabolizing alcohol. This evolutionary upgrade boosted the enzyme's capacity to break down ethanol by 40 times. Primate ancestors, capable of eating fermenting floor fruit, gained access to a rich, dense source of calories that competing species avoided. When Elan licked the bubbling barley water inside Reykjavik Cave, he was tapping into a 10-million-year-old biological gift that made ethanol smell attractive and taste rewarding rather than toxic. Back inside the cold limestone walls of Reykjavik Cave, that ancient biological instinct was about to trigger a cultural revolution. Elan lived during the Natufian period, a transitional era when human groups still relied on wild hunting and gathering, but had begun settling into semi-permanent camps. Outside, the autumn landscape offered limited game, and the band's survival hinged on woven baskets filled with wild barley and wheat gathered from the surrounding Mount Carmel hillsides. As the band prepared a burial site inside the cave floor, to honor their deceased hunter, Ellen returned to the bedrock mortar where the rain-soaked barley lay. He motioned for a younger gatherer named Mira to approach. She crouched cautiously, flared her nostrils, and inhaled the sweet, malty vapor rising from the stone cavity. The grain seeds had sprouted, sending out soft white rootlets that softened the tough outer husks. Rainwater had dissolved the cereal starches into simple sugars, creating an ideal feeding ground for airborne wild yeast. It was not rotting sludge. It was a natural mash undergoing transformation. Ellen realized that if a small amount of rain-soaked grain could produce such an invigorating liquid, they could deliberately craft a larger batch for the upcoming burial ritual. He convinced Mira to help him process a portion of their stored winter seeds. Together, they spread wild barley across damp woven mats near the mouth of the cave, keeping the seeds moist until delicate green sprouts emerged. This critical step, known today as malting, activated natural enzymes inside the seeds, breaking down complex starches into fermentable sugars. Once sprouted, they carried the malted grain deeper into the damp interior of Reykjavik Cave. Using heavy basalt pestles, Elan and Mira pounded the seeds inside deep limestone mortars carved directly into the bedrock floor. The rhythmic thud of stone hitting stone echoed off the cave walls, releasing clouds of golden grain dust into the cool air. Sweat beaded on Elan's forehead as his shoulder muscles burned from the physical exertion. They poured cold spring water over the crushed mash, leaving the stone mortars uncovered to capture floating wild yeast spores. 3 days later, Elan returned to inspect the stone mortars with high expectations. But when he pulled back the shadows, his heart sank. A thick, fuzzy layer of gray mold covered the surface of the liquid. Instead of a sweet, rich aroma, a rank, sour odor filled the air. Uncontrolled wild bacteria had invaded the open mash, turning their valuable grain reserves into a ruined, toxic sludge. Cale, returning from an unsuccessful hunt with cold hands and an empty belly, smelled the foul liquid instantly. Furious, he kicked an empty woven basket across the limestone floor and confronted Alon near the central hearth. Cale pointed his spear at the ruined mortar, shouting that wasting scarce winter food on foolish experiments would cause the entire band to starve before spring. Mira shrank back, her eyes wide with fear, while the rest of the band watched in tense silence. If the vital food supply your group depended on had failed once, would you risk your standing to try again? Alon stood his ground between Cale and the mortars, accepting the guilt of failure, but pleading for one final smaller trial using a modified technique. This dramatic prehistoric struggle is not mere fiction. It mirrors real physical evidence etched into the stone walls of Mount Carmel. In 2018, Professor Li Lu and her archaeological team from Stanford University published a landmark study analyzing 13,000-year-old bedrock mortars excavated at Raqefet Cave in Israel. Using advanced microscopic residue analysis, Professor Lia's team extracted plant microfossils embedded inside the porous limestone surfaces. Under high-powered magnification, they discovered damaged starch granules, displaying distinct signs of enzymatic degradation, unmistakable proof that ancient Natufian hunter-gatherers were sprouting, grinding, and heating wild wheat and barley. The team performed experimental brewing tests to replicate the exact starch degradation patterns found in the cave. Their findings confirmed that humans were actively producing cereal-based fermented drinks for ritual burial feasts 13,000 years ago, establishing that beer production predated the invention of agricultural crop farming by thousands of years. Back in the cave, Alon knew he could not afford another ruined batch. To prevent bad bacteria from taking over the sweet mash, he needed to heat the liquid before fermentation, a technique that required creative engineering in an age before metal pots existed. Using wooden tongs, Mira retrieved smooth cobbles from the edge of the roaring cave hearth, their surfaces glowing red-hot. She carefully lowered the searing stones into the water-filled mortar. The liquid hissed violently, sending plumes of sweet malty steam rising toward the limestone ceiling. The heat sanitized the mash and converted lingering starches into rich sugars. After the liquid cooled, Alon stretched a thick piece of scraped animal hide tightly over the mortar's stone rim, securing it with heavy river stones. By sealing the cavity, he created an oxygen-deprived environment that suppressed mold while allowing wild yeast to thrive. That night, the cave fell into a deep silence, broken only by the crackle of dying hearth embers and the distant whistle of mountain wind. Ellen sat alone on the cold dirt floor, resting his chin on his knees. He leaned his ear close to the sealed leather mortar. From beneath the tight animal hide came a faint rhythmic popping sound. Carbon dioxide gas was building. Inside the dark cavity, as microscopic yeast cells consumed the grain sugars, releasing bubbles that pushed against the leather seal. Ellen closed his eyes and smiled softly. The transformation was working. Invisible biological forces were converting the humble barley mash into a calorie-dense, intoxicating liquid. He resisted the urge to peel back the cover, letting the brew ferment undisturbed in the pitch darkness until the night of the funeral gathering. When the night of the burial ritual arrived, the band gathered around the grave cut into the cave floor. Firelight danced across their solemn faces as they paid homage to their lost companion. Ellen stepped forward and slowly pulled back the heavy leather seal from the bedrock mortar. A warm, pungent vapor filled the chamber, carrying notes of toasted grain, wild honey, and rich alcohol. Inside the stone vessel lay a frothing golden amber liquid. Alon dipped a hollowed stone cup into the thick mash and handed it to Cale. The young hunter hesitated, peering into the bubbling liquid before bringing the cup to his lips and drinking deeply. A look of surprise crossed Cale's face as the sweet, complex flavor hit his tongue. Within minutes, a soothing rush of physical warmth spread through his limbs, easing his muscular tension and softening his guarded expression. He handed the cup back and quietly nodded toward Alon in respect. Could you imagine standing in that dark cave, feeling the sudden rush of physical warmth as the very first sip of beer relaxed your body? As the vessel passed from hand to hand, The sharp edges of grief and winter anxiety dissolved into shared laughter, storytelling, and deep social unity around the flickering fire. As centuries rolled on and agriculture took root across the globe, prehistoric humans expanded their brewing techniques from simple grain mashes into sophisticated mixed alcoholic cocktails. In 2004, Dr. Patrick McGovern, scientific director of biomolecular archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, led an international research team investigating 9,000-year-old ceramic jars excavated at the Neolithic site of Jiahu in Henan Province, China. Dr. McGovern's team applied state-of-the-art chemical extraction methods, including gas chromatography and liquid chromatography, to analyze organic residues absorbed deep within the porous clay walls of the ancient pottery. The chemical fingerprints revealed tartaric acid from wild hawthorn fruit and grapes, beeswax compounds from honey, and botanical markers of rice starch. His team proved that early Chinese farmers were deliberately crafting a complex fermented beverage that combined fruit wine, mead, and rice beer into a single unified recipe. This discovery provided the earliest direct chemical evidence of intentional alcohol crafting in the Neolithic world. The story of human alcohol consumption is a two-tiered journey. It began 10 million years ago as an evolutionary survival mechanism that allowed our primate ancestors to digest fermenting floor fruit. But roughly 13,000 years ago, in places like Rakfet Cave, our ancestors took control of that natural reaction, transforming an accidental biological quirk into a deliberate cultural force. Many scholars now suggest that the desire for a reliable, continuous supply of grain for fermented beverages served as a primary driver for the domestication of wild plants, effectively pushing hunter-gatherers toward permanent farming settlements. Alcohol was not merely a byproduct of civilization, it may have helped build it. As dawn light filters into Rakfet Cave, the funeral feast ends and the band slumbers peacefully near the warm ash of the hearths. Deep inside the bedrock floor, the ancient stone mortars remain. Tiny carbon dioxide bubbles still slowly rise through the golden residue, marking the exact moment humanity learned to brew.